On this week's episode of the podcast, we answer all your most pressing questions.
I made the devil run. I gave him poison just for fun.
All right, welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to another episode of the Weekly Reload Podcast. I'm your host, Stephen Gutowski. I'm also the founder of the reload.com, where you can head over and sign up for our free newsletter right now for free. You'll get all of the most important gun news of the week into your email inbox once a week. You won't get flooded with a bunch of trash spam emails. It'll just be that one newsletter, and you'll be good to go. But if you want to go deeper, of course, you can also buy a membership, which is the only way we make money and the only way we can keep doing this. And also the only way to get a question in on the Q&A episode. You can head over to the reload.com and check out our membership options today to get exclusive access to hundreds of pieces of analysis and exclusive stories. So go and do that. But today, as I alluded to there, we're doing a question and answer episode. I'm here with contributing writer Jake Fogleman. How you doing, Jake?
I'm doing well, Steve. How are you?
I'm doing all right. You ready to answer some questions from the Reload members?
Yeah.
Some of the most pressing issues of the day?
Let's do it. It's one of my favorite segments that we do when we do these periodic Q&A episodes. So I'm excited to see what the members have sent in for us.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that our members are very smart. I don't know. Maybe I'm biased, but I think they often have a lot of good insights and good questions. So and it's no different this time around. So let's get into it. We'll start with the question from Kyle Gershwind from polling question. This one's interesting. So I think it'll give us a little bit of a chance to talk about our philosophy on polls and how we cover polls and so forth. But Kyle asks, how confident should we be in the reliability of opinion polling on guns, i.e. for Sullivan's bans, universal background checks, etc.? For instance, when Americans are asked if they want stricter / the same / looser gun laws, is there any point of reference for how strict the laws currently are? And he's got a number of similar points on that front. When people are asked if they want to ban AR-15s, are they given any additional information on how popular the guns are or how feasible the policy is? And so it's just sort of a general question here on polling. How reliable should we take it to be? How should we look at, public policy polling around guns? And I think this is a good question. Jake, why don't you give it? I want to hear your take first.
Sure. Yeah. So, we've kind of talked whenever we do a news update or whatnot on a particular poll, the typical disclaimers apply that, polling isn't an exact science. Any one particular poll isn't gospel necessarily. But what polling is good for is it generally gives you a good indication of a trend. So if you can maybe see a couple different polls, and if they're all noting something similar, maybe directionally the same, if you're seeing multiple polls from multiple pollsters with a decline in support for gun control, for example, then you can use that to say, oh, maybe something is going on here. But in terms of, any one particular poll saying, 54% of Americans support X policy, that doesn't necessarily mean that, it's an exact 54% concrete number of people that support that policy. And in terms of his question about whether or not people are given context, typically not. That's usually considered priming your polling respondents. So it's usually just a fresh question that they're asked. So they're not necessarily given a whole bunch of context or background before they ask, hey, do you support this policy? Because then that might skew the accuracy of a given poll.
Yeah. I mean, when I look at polling, I think a lot of your points there are very salient. It's not an exact science. You're not going to get perfect results every time. You're not going to be able to take a couple point shift one direction or another as an absolute hard truth. And there are issues, I think, when you're examining polls about how they ask the questions, right? That's a significant issue. I mean, I think base level, right, there's an important distinction to make too between scientific polling and your sort of unscientific polling. This is like a Drudge poll or a poll on a website or a Twitter poll or something. Those are not scientific polls. They don't have the necessary techniques to give you a more reliable answer. They don't have things like, randomization. They're often, polls that are only being answered by people who are seeking out the poll to answer it, which is a problem. You also have representation. Is the sample representative of the people you're trying to get information from? That's another problem with this sort of informal polling, is that it's basically completely unreliable. But that's why the major polling firms, Quinnipiac, Pew, Gallup, Fox, CBS, all these, the major polling firms have at least some of those basic safeguards in place to give you some level of reliability that you're not going to get from just your Facebook poll that you put up, right? And so that's I think the first important thing to note about polling is like there's very different levels of reliability among polls. And before you talk about any poll, I think it's important that it has at least those basic safeguards of a randomized sample that's representative of the people you're trying to you're trying to get the opinion of, and that the wording is done in a way that's at least somewhat neutral. There's always going to be difficulty in getting to the perfect question because some of the issues here that Kyle brings up on, for instance, banning AR-15s or assault weapons or whatever. If you don't offer the definition for what an assault weapon is, or people don't have a conception for how popular AR-15s are, or how realistic the idea of trying to confiscate them is. The poll is going to come out all kinds of different ways. And but at the same time, if you ask someone, do you want to ban the AR-15, which, by the way, is this great, awesome, popular gun, and no one would give them up anyway, like that's also not a fair way to phrase a question. So there is a lot of ambiguity that goes into it, and a lot of skill really that's required to get answers that are actually useful. And frankly, we're working with most of the time very imperfect polling in that regard, but it can still be useful, I think, because a lot of times it's all you've got. Right. We don't have the funds to conduct our own polling. It's very expensive, generally speaking, to do. But you kind of have to work around those limitations, try and point them out to the reader if possible. Be upfront with people about what was specifically asked about, and why the results matter. And you will get a lot of times, even in a perfect poll, a poll that's done really well, you'll get answers that are contradictory. Like public opinion is not necessarily consistent on any issue. This is another point that Kyle brings up. Like you're going to get results that seem to contradict themselves, or especially like if you're looking at them from a particular ideological point of view, they might seem to contradict themselves in your mind, right? Like for instance, you'll often find in polling, especially, we've done a lot of pieces on the recent polling in Texas on the race between Beto O'Rourke and Greg Abbott. And you'll find there that Texans want stricter gun laws, right? But they also want teachers to be armed. They don't like Beto O'Rourke, and they put Greg Abbott well ahead of him, but they support, there's a majority support for 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 a mandatory buyback of AR-15s and other guns, at least in one poll. Now, another poll shows that a ban on assault weapons there's majority opposition to that in Texas. So, now these are not hugely divergent results. It's not like one poll found 90% of people were for confiscation. The other poll found 90% were against the ban. It was like 50 is in the 50-50 range for both of those polls. But still, you're going to have variation from poll to poll. You're going to have slight differences in the way that you ask a question. What does banning assault weapons mean? What is it? What is a mandatory buyback? I mean, I think to a lot of people who don't understand what that policy is, the idea of a buyback sounds like something that isn't necessarily mandatory. And so, even though they do describe it as mandatory buyback. I think a lot of people might be confused as to what exactly that means. Like, that sounds like you go somewhere and sell your gun to somebody. But in reality, it's just confiscation because you don't have an option. And people who refuse to do it will be, prosecuted. That's what Beto has said. Now, obviously Beto said a lot of things, but so, I think polling, a lot of people will just reject polling outright as completely unreliable and useless, but it's one of the only measures of how people feel about, different policies that isn't just based off of anecdotes, right, basically. And while it's not 100% reliable, as everyone knows, there are lots of polling is a snapshot in time, and it's one that relies on the skill of the pollster to, filter the results with, especially when you're talking about elections. They might poll a certain number of people, but then they have to screen who they believe is going to actually show up and vote, because that's different from who, all adults or all registered voters that aren't all going to show up to vote in an election. So what they think is not really what matters. It's what the people who are going to vote think that matters, right, in the end. And so that's another layer of subjectivity that's based on, hopefully, if you're a good pollster, experience and evidence will give you a likely voter filter that's actually fairly accurate. And then, obviously so polling is fairly complicated, as you can see from what we've been talking about here. Right. But I think it is still valuable and useful in at least giving you some sense of what's going on beyond just anecdotes, because that's honestly the only other thing you really have to rely on when you're trying to gauge what people think on an issue. And, the anecdotes that from you and your friends or people you meet at gun shows or whatever are going to be wildly different from, Shannon Watts and her friends and the people she meets at wherever gun control advocates hang out. I don't really know, but so polling is not perfect, but it is a useful indicator of what's going on at a given moment in time. And I think Jake is right. It's especially useful for following trends. Right. So for us, a big point of emphasis in our recent coverage was on the trend of falling support for assault weapons bans, AR-15 bans in the wake of the Uvalde shooting. That was particularly newsworthy and interesting because it went against what you'd expect to see. And it showed a distinct change in American attitudes towards these types of firearms at a time where there was more political pressure to ban them than there has been in quite a long time, right? In decades, really. So, as you saw with the House passing their version of the assault weapons ban, but so that's. I mean, polling is. I think it's a big topic. I know I talked a lot about it there, but But I think it's an important one because it's a lot of what we write about, and it's always going to be a fairly controversial thing. There's a lot of theories about, whether gun owners are willing to be forthcoming with pollsters about their, especially about owning firearms. That's, I think, an ongoing debate about how accurate polls are at capturing gun ownership. We obviously have spent a lot of time covering the recent survey of gun owners, the largest one ever conducted by Georgetown professor William English. And so, I don't think it's something you can just toss out or ignore, especially people of course, people have the tendency to like polls when they say what they like, right, and then dispute them when they say what they don't like. We try to stay away from that and just give a forthright explanation of what's going on and explain those caveats that Kyle brought up there. But yeah, I think that's our overarching view. It's kind of long-winded, I guess, but it's that's what we think about polling. Let's move on to the next question here. That we got some questions on ATF rulemaking because that's the next. That's a pretty significant part of our coverage and what's going on with guns. We got Ken Lewis who asks, the ATF's new rule went into effect on 80% receivers and not much changed. They are still for sale. So what did the rule accomplish? And what does that say about the pistol arm brace rule that is forthcoming? You want to give that one a shot?
Sure. Yeah. So what did change is essentially the availability of complete kits. So your incomplete receivers with the jigs and the instructions on how to totally complete it. Those did get pulled, especially from the bigger companies that were selling them, like Polymer 80. They've complied with the new rules. But as you pointed out, all of the individual components are still around. And the ATF realizes this. Obviously, I think a lot of the media and maybe perhaps some political actors were caught off guard by this because you've seen a lot of coverage in recent weeks about, ghost gun companies are still producing. What's going on? Are they flaunting the ban? And that's if you followed what we covered this, if you followed what the ban actually said, it was that, hey, the kits are no longer allowed to be sold together. And that's exactly what happened. So, it didn't accomplish. It accomplished what it set out to do if you take just the literal words of the rule. But I think some political actors were expecting a more comprehensive blockade on the supply of ghost gun or of so-called ghost guns. And that's obviously not what happened.
Yeah. I mean, the problem with rulemaking is that you can only do so much. Right. You can't just invent a new law out of thin air. I mean, obviously some people will argue that is what they do, but and perhaps this is being challenged in court and could, much like the bump stock ban, could eventually be struck down. But there really is a more limited range of options when you're trying to work from current law and interpret it in certain ways. The redefinition of what a receiver is to include, unfinished parts, and as they're included when they're combined with kits that help you to finish them, that has probably more standing than maybe the bump stock ban, just because it's the definition of receiver and frame are effectively left up to regulators under federal law. There's a specific definition under federal law, and so what they were working from previously was just a rule made by the federal government or the regulators at the time, and now they're changing that rule. Is it overly broad? I mean, probably it's pretty broad, but it's something that at least is in the area of rulemaking, and they can't just go out and ban private gun making, for instance, because they'd need an actual federal law to do that, which would, right, likely be unconstitutional under the Bruen standard. But either way, it's not surprising to us, right, that this is how things turned out with the ghost gun rule, because this is what the rule said. It's going, and it's really in line with what the ATF was already doing before the rule came down. They were already going after these buy, build, shoot kits or whatever. And so they're just trying to whittle those down to the point where you can only basically sell the bare components and you can't sell them together, which is, of course, logically is still quite questionable as to the idea that a non-functioning receiver combined with, drill bits and a jig is the same thing as a functioning firearm is, still going to be legally and logically questionable. But yeah, it never was going to do what the gun control advocates said it would. And it doesn't, and people are surprised by that. And you wouldn't be if you read the reload, right?
That's right.
But as for the pistol brace rule, I think that one is a bit more substantial in its effects. And actually, we have another question on this from Cody Claxton, who asks, given the upcoming pistol brace ATF rule enforcements, there seems to be a lot of confusion around these, pistols. People are still selling guns with braces attached out there on the market. There's still plenty of people making these firearms at the moment. And so he's asking what, how is that going to work once the rule goes into effect? How's the registration process supposed to work? And then, he has another question about if you just remove the brace, what is that? How's that gun come out legally? Now, obviously, we can't give any sort of legal advice, but I think there's a couple interesting parts in there. But
right.
First, let's just start off with what the pistol brace ban is going to do, right? And effectively, it creates, now the final rule isn't out yet. This is an important thing. We have the draft that was published. Then there was the comment period where there were quite a lot of comments given on it. One of the weird things about the pistol brace rule is that it seems to have gotten, it's, in my opinion, it is far more substantial than the ghost gun rule. The ghost gun rule was honestly less about ghost guns and more about fixing issues they had in court with their definition of receiver, because there were people prosecuted for being felons in possession of a lower receiver of an AR-15. But the problem with that is that the definition of receiver doesn't fit. The previous definition didn't really fit the lower receiver on an AR-15. It didn't have the parts that were required for it to be a receiver under the rule. And so there were cases that started getting thrown out for that. And that was, I think, more the main catalyst for that rule change, even though the political focus was all on ghost guns and ghost gun kits. The more substantial change had to do with that. So they could basically clean up this definition that they'd had for 50 years, something like that.
Yeah.
And it just doesn't have that much of a practical effect in real life on the vast majority of people. Whereas the pistol brace rule has the potential to affect millions of American gun owners. Because if you look at the draft, now this could change because by the time they publish the final rule, which is scheduled for December, but that would effectively make most any gun that has a pistol brace attached to it legally a short barrel rifle or shotgun. Because if you look at they came up with this whole numbering,
it's like a
point
scorecard system. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. It's still fairly subjective, but really you run through the point system, and most every popular brace on any kind of gun is going to run afoul of that point system. Like the vast majority of them will be classified as short barrel rifles, which is a problem, right? Because short barrel rifles under the National Firearms Act require registration and a tax stamp, and is a felony, a federal felony, not to register and pay your tax on short barrel rifles. And you can't build them either without authorization from, without going through the registration process. You can't retroactively go through that. Now there's some evidence that they're going to, and the rule talks about, then perhaps an amnesty period where people can register the ones that they already have. Now, the ATF's position on all this stuff is like, is extremely frustrating, I think, to a lot of people, but it's always basically been that, we only judge the guns themselves, not the individual components. So they've always, even though they've given out authorization letters that say, this brace on this gun is fine, is not an SBR or an SBS or whatever. They've always tried to maintain this position that they can't give categorical approval to anything, and so they can only judge guns that they actually have. And you can't. It's not even like you can actually. This is still the case under this new under the draft regulation, and so it's still kind of like, well, we can't really judge any of your guns unless we personally see the individual gun itself. And, the only time that happens is if they're recovered in a crime. So you just might be a felon and not know it, sort of thing. Now they give you the point system. The idea is you're supposed to be able to look at your own gun and try to go through this point system and figure out if your gun is, the way it's set up is illegal. But it's still fairly subjective, and I think reading it broadly would put most braced ARs under the SBR requirement. And so that's millions of people, most likely, given the popularity of those guns over the last decade or so. So this has a much larger impact, but for some reason, the gun control people got really upset that it was they wanted to take an extra like 2 months with the ghost gun rule. And so they blew up the ATF leadership. They, sacked Marvin Richardson. They brought in a temporary director before Dettelbach could get confirmed. And they did all this because they were upset that they weren't moving this ghost gun regulation, which really doesn't have much of a practical impact. They were going to take another month or two to get that into place. Whereas this pistol brace one, which has way more practical impact in real life, has been pushed from this summer to this winter. And so it's unclear why there's less of a emphasis or concern about that one from the gun control side. It's really quite confusing, honestly, but it is something that's going to have a significant impact on anyone who owns a gun with a pistol brace attached to it. And, in theory, yes, you could remove, you want to talk to a lawyer before you put your freedom on the line for, over the pistol brace setup. There will be, of course, legal challenges to all of this that crop up, I guarantee you. But, if you look at the point system, just removing the brace and just having your, on an AR, for instance, and just having the buffer tube does take your points down a lot in most cases. So it might be an option for a lot of people just to wait out the legal case by just taking their pistol brace off of their AR.
Right. Or you just attach it to an AR with a 16-inch plus barrel, because the criteria has to do, like you said, cumulatively within a complete firearm. And so then you wouldn't run afoul of any SBR rules if that was the case as well. But as we said, caveats aside, no, we're not lawyers. Don't take us for legal advice. But
yeah, I mean, so, I just find the whole situation with the pistol brace ban to be pretty fascinating. And yeah, I mean, there probably are ways to reduce the point count. If that's how the final rule comes out, we still don't know what exactly their final rule is going to be, if they're going to change anything or what. But if it comes out that way, that would be how you would maybe bring your points down. Anyway, there's also like the ATF is very unlikely to go door to door and check all your guns to try and figure this out too. Right. So, there's sort of a practical aspect to enforcing this sort of thing too. I mean, you've seen that with a lot of confiscation efforts in the United States, whether it was the SAFE Act or confiscation, or even just registration efforts, whether you're talking about New York SAFE Act or New Jersey's magazine confiscation effort that they put into place a couple of years ago. Basically, nobody complies with these things. Right. And there's generally no mass effort to enforce them in real life. They just sort of are unenforced crimes that are on the books, which is still not a good thing and for society and quite bad, but that's usually the practical outcome of it. Either way, what's the next question we got?
Yeah, we got some questions about the NRA and sort of Second Amendment advocacy groups more broadly. This comes from Josiah Hunter. He asks what we think the pro-2A movement is going to look like in a post-NRA landscape. So he's assuming that the NRA either folds or emerges from its legal troubles that we've covered pretty extensively, just in a different form or a different strength. And he talks about, what does that look like in a world where they're no longer the top dog? And he asks specifically about things like the lobbying world, gun safety and training, instructor certification, which obviously is something that the NRA does far more than some of the other groups have the means to do currently. So what do you think, Steve? What does that world look like without the NRA being the top dog?
I think that's a really good question that gets wildly overlooked by basically everyone in media, whether it's gun media or political media or news media, what have you. Nobody is really talking about this very much, and it's hugely important because the NRA is far more important to gun politics than people seem to want to believe anymore. Even the gun control groups have kind of moved on to new boogeymen. Like they're talking about the National Shooting Sports Foundation, which is the industry's trade group, as they're kind of setting them up for to be the new boogeyman of the gun control movement. And, first off, the NRA isn't gone. It's still the largest and most influential gun rights group in the country, or any kind of gun group. You look at their finances; they're terrible compared to the NRA's previous finances. They're still way beyond anyone else working on the gun issue today. The gun control groups are catching up a bit. If you look at some of their, like the PAC numbers, and we'll have more on this in the near future. But if you look at political spending from their PACs, the NRA's fundraising has fallen off and spending has fallen off significantly over the last several years. And they're being caught by the gun control groups who, now that it takes three significant gun control groups to match, what the NRA is trying to do, Everytown, Giffords and Brady, but they are getting much closer. I will say, of course, that Everytown, for instance, was supposed to spend $60 million in 2020 and then just didn't do it. And no one even noticed outside, like, really was the only one who covered the fact that they fell wildly short. They spent about 25 million of their planned 60 million. And now obviously the pandemic happened. So that's probably part of the reason, but Michael Bloomberg just didn't give them the money that year that he had pledged. So, it's not as though the gun control groups are doing so great on their own, and they are still largely reliant on really big dollar donors like Michael Bloomberg almost exclusively.
Right.
That guy has really funded the vast majority of the modern gun control movement. It hasn't been. It's a very different funding structure than what you see at the NRA, which does rely much more on smaller donors, individual donors, than the gun control side. But either way, point is they're not doing nearly as much as they were, and nobody is making up that gap. There are areas where the other gun rights groups are sort of picking up the slack almost exclusively in the legal realm, where the NRA hasn't been, a super active group anyway for a long time, even when their finances were much higher. Certainly they're not in it. They're still important. They were their state affiliate is the New York Rifles, or the New York State Rifle and Pistol Association, which just won the Bruen case. So,
right.
You can't discount their legal efforts altogether either. But, groups like the Second Amendment Foundation and Firearms Policy Coalition and Gun Owners of America have become much more active. I mean, some of them were around and very active. Second Amendment Foundation has been around for a long time doing legal work. But, that's an area where you're seeing more of the slack being picked up by these gun rights groups. But you're not seeing that nearly as much in the lobbying realm, in DC, at the state level. You're seeing some more effort from Gun Owners of America than you have in the past, especially in places like Pennsylvania. They've got more of a ground team together there, but really nobody is matching what the NRA has traditionally done in those areas, and that's a huge problem, I think, going forward, especially if the NRA continues on this trajectory of losing money in membership and maybe even has its, losing in court. They just lost another case in the Second Circuit on their First Amendment claims against some New York officials from 2018, and they've had a string of losses. They lost bankruptcy. They've had to settle with their former contractor, Echo McQueen. They've lost efforts to try and move this New York case to different courts. And the whole thing has had a really detrimental impact on the organization. And I mean, honestly, you don't even hear very much about them in DC right now. Maybe that'll change as the election season heats up and they start spending more money in some of these swing races. I mean, that's always been a big part of that they've played that no one else is, as far as I can tell, as far as we've seen, right, Jake, has really tried to take up that mantle. And so it's a pretty big deal for the NRA to be weakened because the NRA does a lot of stuff. I mean, yeah, safety and training is another great example of, they're still doing it. It's not like they don't exist anymore, but they're smaller than they were. They have less resources to commit to that. They're spending the biggest line item in their budget has been on administrative legal expenses, which is effectively paying their outside lawyer and others to fight their dissolution case in New York, this corruption case that they're under. Now there is a bright spot in that case, and just in the fact that Letitia James, the New York Attorney General, requested full dissolution of the NRA, right, to completely disband it as a potential punishment for the allegations of corruption over there. But that was taken off the table by the judge, so they won't be disbanded. So they will exist. They'll continue to exist after this case, so long as their finances stay sustainable, which is honestly a legitimate question. I mean, for instance, their membership has been shrinking since 2018, according to internal documents that we published earlier this year. We don't hear anything about their membership from them anymore, which is a bad sign, right? If they were gaining a lot of members, which frankly, you would think that they would be at this. This is a political environment where they should be gaining members, right? You had 2 straight years of record gun sales, millions of new gun owners, and a president who is hostile towards gun rights, is pushing for all sorts of new gun control legislation. You just had the first federal gun restrictions passed in decades. All of these that you have a candidate running in Texas who's openly for confiscation of firearms. You would think that all of these things would combine to generate more memberships for the NRA. Like and we're in an election year, right? But the NRA has made no announcements about putting any numbers on their, whether they've got new members. And even if they're still using the 5 million number, which we know from the internal documents has not been accurate for a while. They first hit 5 million back in 2012. I mean, is it 2012 or 2013? So either way, it's like about a decade ago. And they should be, just by population growth alone, significantly higher than that. So there's a lot of problems. They may get reformed effectively through this court case, because what's left on the table is removing basically NRA leadership. Wayne LaPierre, other members of the executive committee, and that could result in a brand new NRA. Now, I think people are rightfully skeptical that Letitia James is going to, given that she would be the one advocating for this, is that it's going to end up as a positive thing for the organization, even if she gets to that point. I mean, a lot of people, of course, Wayne LaPierre has a lot of critics in the gun rights movement. A lot of people want to see him removed from leadership at the NRA, but the same people probably don't trust Letitia James very much. And so really, if you're somebody who wants to see the NRA's leadership removed and replaced, you think they're doing a poor job based on, the financial performance, the legal performance, all this stuff that's happened, the shrinking of the membership. Your best hope is probably the judge in that New York case. Just hope that he's actually worried about the interests of the members over anyone else. So, it is a significant problem, and it's one that's not talked about much. The waning influence of the NRA is a big deal. They are the main player in the political realm. There's nobody else that comes anywhere close to having their level of influence on Capitol Hill on gun issues, or really in a lot of state houses too. There's a lot of great state-based groups. Of course, a lot of them are NRA affiliates, and there are plenty that aren't NRA affiliates that are also very influential in the state houses. But it's not as though you've seen a big push from anyone to try and replace the NRA's a number of the things they do. Really, the legal realm, you've seen a lot of the gun rights groups have gone there. That's sort of the current fad is getting, filing your own lawsuits, which not a bad idea at this point in time, right? There's a lot of fertile ground for winning those cases right now. So it makes sense, and you don't need as much organization or money to get involved in that as you would to build a nationwide gun rights network that's actually influential across the country and on Capitol Hill. Those are much harder things to do and take a lot longer, especially when the NRA is still around. Like, they're not going to want to cede ground to other groups, of course. And while they might very well work with them, it's still much harder to gain influence while the NRA is still sort of, well, not as big or influential as it was. It's still out there and it's still significant. But that's that's the reality of the situation. I think a lot of people just assume the NRA doesn't matter if you know, a lot of people who've given up on the NRA as an organization, think, you know, who agree with that the corruption is disqualifying or so forth, or what have you. People in that camp, I feel like the prevailing opinion of a lot of those people is that the NRA just doesn't matter anymore. And so we don't need to worry about what happens with them. And I don't think that's remotely true is the problem. What do you think?
I think that captures the crux of it. I think part of the question here is assuming that the NRA goes away. And as you pointed out, they are very much still around. You know, they've had their troubles, but they're still here. So you're not going to see other groups fill some of the niches that they currently fill outside of perhaps litigation, as you've pointed out, while they're still around. And so, yeah, the fact that, they are decreasing their spending on things like lobbying and their safety training, it doesn't matter. Everyone knows NRA instructor certifications, for example. That's pretty ubiquitous throughout the country. And he points to...
I mean, I'm still a certified instructor
right.
for basic pistol. Like, it's not... and there aren't really... You know, USCCA is doing their own training program. There's some other ones out there, but nobody is at anywhere near the scale that the NRA is. It's just not even close.
And the recognition.
I don't think people get that. I don't think people get how hard it will be to replace what they've done, especially when they're still around, you know, or to reform the organization. You know, there have been some people who have tried to reform from the inside, you know, Judge Journey, who was a board member. You've got Rob Pincus, who, you know, was involved with Save the Second. And those efforts really have not gone very far. They haven't accomplished very much, just frankly. They haven't gotten a lot of this popular support to do it. You know, it's not like you go to the NRA annual meeting and it's not as though there's a huge outpouring of support for Wayne necessarily. I mean, there's like all the governance meetings that happened during that, where there was like nobody there, basically. And the convention was tiny compared to previous years. We did pieces on it, you know, at the time. I think that it was like 2006 was the last time they had membership, attendance that low. They only had like 500 people vote in the 76th, director election, which is decided at the annual meetings. Like the every metric you can look at is very negative for the NRA right now. Like it just is. There's no sugarcoating it. But at the same time, it's not as though you've seen, you know, the thousands of people pour out to support the reformers either. So, you know, I don't know. If you're somebody who's hoping for the NRA to significantly change, your only real hope is that the judge forces them to, because there's no the internal effort for reform has failed effectively, at least to this point. Maybe something will change, and the people in charge don't think that they have really done much of anything wrong. So they're not going to, there's not likely to be any changes among the people who are already running the organization. So, I mean, like, it's not a pretty picture, but, and look, you know, the NRA I'm always happy to have someone from the NRA on the show to, you know, talk, to defend the organization and how it's run itself. You know, we've had some of the reformers on the show in the past, and I, you know, we've asked them hard questions as well. But you know, I think what people miss is that it's like you're saying, it's an important organization. It's still extremely important, and what happens with it really matters a lot for gun politics in America.
Yeah, I think that's right. We're going to move on to we have several questions about reciprocity in the wake of the Bruen decision. We'll start with William S. And he asks, does the Bruen ruling and New York City's recently passed concealed carry laws give the United States Supreme Court the motivation/reason to take a case addressing national reciprocity? And he asks, you know, about sensitive places in New York City and overturning that. If that gets overturned, does that open the door for sensitive places? And several other questions. Ken and Luigi both ask for their specific states where they're at, if we could see any movement in reciprocity. So what do you think is going to be the landscape for reciprocity now that Bruen has been decided?
Yeah, that's a really good question, right? I think it's one of those things that was left unaddressed in Bruen, just completely unaddressed. Unlike Ren v. DC, which is the case where DC's May issue law was thrown out, the Supreme Court did not require that New York issue permits to people from out of state even. They didn't require that New York recognize any other state's permits. Really, they just focused completely on the process for obtaining a permit and how New York's subjective, may issue law was not constitutional. But they didn't talk at all about reciprocity. And I think that's something that's going to take a while to get addressed.
Yeah.
That's been a top priority of the gun rights movement at the federal level for a long time. Rep Hudson out of North Carolina, he's been pushing for national reciprocity for years, but it's never gone anywhere.
Right.
The problem being that you need 60 votes in the Senate, and while you could, during the beginning of the Trump administration, you might have been able to get, mid 50s on a bill like that. It's probably very hard to pass something like that at the federal level. I mean, that's why you've seen basically no gun rights legislation for decades in the United States. I mean, the biggest federal accomplishment for gun rights since the turn of the millennium has been the expiration of the Sullivan's ban, which required the federal government to do nothing.
Right.
You just haven't had much in the way of gun rights legislation at the national level, and it's unlikely that you're going to see national reciprocity make it through. And so, it's another area where the courts are probably your best bet, and there hasn't really been much in the way of an organized challenge to you're in favor of national reciprocity or challenging the different states, require lack of recognition for other states' permits.
Yeah.
Maybe you have a full faith and credit challenge. I don't know. I haven't seen anyone seriously talking about this in the legal, the gun rights legal landscape. So it doesn't seem like something that's coming up anytime soon. I think there's other fights that the gun rights movement, the gun rights groups feel more confident in taking on. And this one is probably down the list a ways. So I wouldn't expect national reciprocity to happen anytime soon, either by legislation or court order.
Yeah.
The best thing you can hope for on that front is something like what happened in Virginia a couple of years ago, which is where they recognized every other state's permit. And so sometimes that'll give you, if your state does that, that often gives you a few more states where your permit's recognized, because some states require, mutual recognition to recognize other people's permits. But, if you're talking about places like DC, New York, California, it's unlikely that they're ever going to voluntarily recognize anyone else's permits. And it'll probably be a long time before anyone tries a case like that in a serious way to force them to recognize it. So
yeah,
I don't think that Bruen really has much of an effect in this regard, at least not for a while. There's just so many other cases that they're gonna go through first.
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. And you could even kind of tell in the Kavanaugh concurrent opinion in Bruen, where he seemed to be willing to leave a lot of room for states to handle their permitting. As so long as it was objective, he seemed to be like, hey, do what you want as long as you're objectively granting these permits. And it would just seems like a stretch to then immediately turn around and say, okay, now states, you must recognize every other state's permit. So I think you have a good point there, that this is going to be something that's going to take either legislation at the federal level where there's a big 60 seat win for the Republican Party, or it's going to be a court case down the road. I think that's a good point.
Yeah, and I think there's more of a chance that you'll see courts force states to issue non-resident permits rather than to accept other states' permits, because at least in that case, the state would still have control over the process. And so, I just think it's a long ways off. We also had Luigi ask, is it better to apply for a CCW in California now or after the midterms? And ideally under a different, maybe you get a better sheriff in the meantime.
Sure.
Right. Wherever you are in California, because that's who issues this permits in California. And I would say that for places there, right now in places like California and Maryland, for instance, I would immediately try to get the permit if I were you.
Yep.
Because
100%.
California's going to pass a New York cop style concealed carry restriction bill at the end of this year. Almost certainly. They tried to pass it on an emergency basis a little while back and failed because they couldn't get to I think it was 2/3 needed to, they fell short by a couple of votes, but once they can pass it by, simple majority and they'll get the votes for that. They just have to wait until the next session, which starts in December, I believe. Mm-hmm. And so once that happens, there's going to be a lot more restrictions in place, and I think it may also change how they're issued. I think they're going to centralize that process to the Attorney General. So if you have the opportunity to go and get one right now, that's probably your best bet. Obviously you'll still have to abide by the new restrictions they put in place, which are going to be extremely onerous, as you've seen in New York. But at least you'll have the permit. Whereas, you might, if they double down on these good character clauses, which are basically very similar to the good reason clause that was struck down in Bruen, but will still probably hold you up from being able to get the permit once those laws actually go in place, or at least it'll be a lot harder.
Yeah.
And then in Maryland, it's a similar idea where right now there's a Republican governor, but it's very unlikely that the Republican who is running for, that Governor Hogan is retiring or not running for re-election. And so his Republican replacement, he's refused to endorse. He's kind of this, further right MAGA type guy, and it's Maryland. So almost certainly going to lose. And that means that Democrats will have total control of the state government in Maryland, which means they will probably try and pass some sort of restriction on gun carry there. So if you have the opportunity to get a permit now in Maryland, I would do that. And there's probably a couple other states where that's also the case, but those are sort of two examples. Anyway, next up, we got another blue state question, assault weapons related. We got Charles in Delaware, where he says they recently passed an assault weapons ban. And now the Delaware State Sportsmen Association is suing the state over this ban, and he's wondering if it's going to be successful. And so Delaware is the one state that has passed an assault weapons ban in the last 25 years. Yeah, a new one. And so they kind of were the one example against my, couple of recent pieces where I wrote that the assault weapons ban era is over because the polling has moved against it. There's no path for it to pass in Congress anytime soon, and there really hadn't been any states that passed it since the 90s until Delaware did this and sort of threw a wrench into that. And then, of course, the third prong of the reason why I believe the assault weapons ban era is over is the legal side of things. There's much less of a chance that these bills are going to survive scrutiny under Bruen. There just isn't a historical analog really for assault weapons bans. These bans on popular firearms like the AR-15 and AK-47 and a myriad of other guns are usually affected by these assault weapons bans. Of course, as we've talked about a number of times before, assault weapon varies the definition of it from state to state where these things have been imposed. I think Delaware's ban is the more updated version that covers a lot more firearms, sort of like the new assault weapons ban in the House was sort of twice as strict as the old one, because it went from you could have 2 features to you can only have 1 feature for, of these banned features on your gun. And so do I think it'll be successful? Probably. I mean, that's, I think we had, another question about the status of the assault weapons bans across the country and the legal challenges to them. And my guess is that you'll have a conclusion in one of those other cases before you get one in this Delaware case. But it'll probably be substantial. Now, it'll probably take another several months to a year for you to start seeing, final opinions in these sorts of cases. I think with California, the Ninth Circuit sent their case back down. The Supreme Court after Bruen accepted 4 gun rights cases. I believe 2 of those were assault weapons bans, right, Jake?
Just 1, I believe. 2 were magazine cases.
All right. Similar case.
Yeah.
Those are kind of magazine limits, and assault weapons bans are going to be.
They kind of go hand in hand. Yeah.
Yeah, they're going to be decided fairly similarly, I would imagine. And, but yeah, so there's a Maryland case and a California case. And they've both, I believe, been sent back down to their district court levels where they're progressing at different speeds. I think the one in California is progressing quite quickly because that went to Judge Benitez, who has struck down a lot of California gun laws.
Right.
And already struck down the assault weapons ban under a reasoning that was pretty close to what the Bruen standard is.
Yeah.
So that case is probably going to move pretty fast.
Plus the Colorado cases that we've been covering in federal court, there've already been some temporary restraining orders issued against local assault weapons bans, and that's a federal court decision as well. So, obviously you can't predict 100% what this Delaware judge is going to do. There's always wild cards in legal cases, but the trends seem to indicate that things are moving against the legality of assault weapons bans in this post-Bruen landscape.
Yeah, absolutely. Those 2 Colorado cases were also by Democratic appointees. One was an Obama appointee, another one was a Biden appointee. So that was actually kind of surprising because of that. It seems like perhaps the lower courts are going to be, from what's happened thus far, it does seem like the lower courts are going to be a lot more, faithful in applying the Supreme Court standard for gun cases moving forward. So it is very hard to justify an assault weapons ban, which the concept for this didn't occur until the mid 20th century, really the late 20th century. Like the first one was in the 80s, I think.
Yeah, like 89.
California. Yeah. So, and you're talking about banning guns that are clearly in common use. They're the most popular rifle is the AR-15. There's 24 million of them out there. There's no coincidence that the National Shooting Sports Foundation put out that report at the time that it did earlier this year. Right. When the assault weapons ban was passed in the House. Their point is these are in common use for lawful purposes. There's one behind my head right now. Like, this is not a unusual and dangerous weapon as would be potentially allowed that the government would potentially be allowed to restrict under the Heller and Bruen standard. But so I think there's a good chance that eventually the law will get struck down. The problem is, of course, in the meantime, it's not going to happen overnight. These rulings are not going to come out overnight. And but anyway, we get on to our last question here. We've got Liz Mayer, who who I've known for a long time and has he's done some work in this area on the financial, government pressuring financial institutions to stop working with controversial industries or disfavored industries, I guess is a better way of putting it. But Liz is asking about the MCC changes. She said, to what extent do you think recent action by credit card companies to tag gun sales in a way that may reduce their likelihood of being processed signals a move by government or quasi-government organizations to try to push gun control through the back door, as they did back in the day under President Obama with Operation Choke Point? And so, well, I think there's a couple things to address in there, right? I mean, first is, let's talk about what Operation Choke Point was, just to begin with, real quick, just a refresher. So Choke Point was the Obama administration's effort to get financial institutions to stop working with certain industries that they didn't like. This included, the payday lender industry, the gun industry, of course, and the adult entertainment industry. And, it did this by trying to, intimidate them into not working with these groups by talking about, the reputational risks of it, and giving them incentives not to engage in that kind of business. And so it was basically a government effort to pressure these, big banks into just not, it is trying to limit these industries they didn't approve of. Totally legal industries, of course. And that was the problem. And so that blew up and became a huge, pretty significant scandal under the Obama administration, and they eventually backed off. But now, of course, the effort to get financial institutions to stop working with these industries, especially the gun industry, has never stopped, of course. They've just been a bit less overt in pressure directly from the government. And I think the MCC changes, the merchant category code change that we've covered the last couple of weeks, is an example of that. Yeah. Now, it's not government pressure in this case, as far as we know to this point, outside of, there was a letter from some Democratic senators and
Senator Warren.
Yeah, Warren and Letitia James from New York put out a press release talking about supporting this idea, because the gun control groups have been pushing this for a while now, and Amalgamated Bank, which is the bank of a lot of the democratic institutions out there, is sort of an activist bank. But it wasn't quite to the level of Choke Point, which was more of a direct government operation to pressure these institutions. This was more of a concerted effort by activists, which was supported rhetorically by these elected officials. But it also doesn't necessarily reduce the likelihood that they're going to be processed. The sales at the new MCC code for gun stores. That's the banks all have said that they won't use it that way, and that they'll, Visa and MasterCard have said that they won't allow it to be used that way in their network, and that they'll, you can't use MCC codes to deny any legal transactions. But obviously it's still part of that effort to pressure financial institutions into instituting a sort of privatized version of gun control. You saw this with big banks a couple of years back, especially after Parkland, where they, Citibank and Bank of America cut ties with gun companies, said they wouldn't do business with them, wouldn't lend them money anymore unless they stopped making, AR-15s or guns that the banks didn't like. It's certainly an ongoing effort to restrict the gun industry and gun sales on a sort of private basis on the private side of things through, coordinating policies among the major financial institutions. And it is something that now, we've talked about the MCC change, obviously, a lot on the show and at the Reload. And on its own, it doesn't do much of anything. But of course, the goal is not just changing this MCC code. The goal is to try and monitor gun sales to identify suspicious patterns and then report those to the police under the guise of preventing mass shootings. So there's a lot more steps that would have to happen before they got to that goal, but that is the end goal of these activists. And it is part of a larger effort to use private institutions to restrict gun sales rather than passing laws or really in addition to the effort to try and pass laws. Right.
Yeah, no, I think that's the main difference between this and something like Choke Point. The fact that it was activist driven and private company driven rather than an overt effort by the federal government to stick its nose in business and push it a certain way. So I think that is the big difference. And like you said, it doesn't do anything at the moment to restrict the processing of gun sales. So until that changes, I think that is a noteworthy difference.
I think that's something that's going to be ongoing too, right?
Yeah.
And this is not the last fight in that effort. And this one's not even over yet. The MCC code change, right? There's still a fight over that itself that we're going to continue to follow and report on as well. But I think that answers every question that we've got on our list here. Hopefully, if we didn't get to your question, you remember, I will try to answer by email. But yeah, we appreciate you guys sending these in. There are a lot of really good questions. We were able to explore a lot of interesting topics. I think it's going to be valuable for everyone who gets to listen to it. Of course, members will get it first, as always, on Sundays, and then it'll go live to everybody else on Monday. But members also, by the way, have the opportunity to appear on the show. I believe we'll have a member segment next week that will do exactly that. So I'm looking forward to that one. But for now, that's it. Head over to thereload.com, sign up for our free newsletter, and buy a membership if you want to get even more knowledge and information from an informed, independent outlet like The Reload. But until next week, we will see you guys.